Welcome. The GSM News channel decided to take it upon themselves to criticize one of my videos. So I've labeled them the Disinformation channel, because most of what they say in there is absolute rubbish. Oh, by the way, GSM News, did you know that this solar image you're using in the background here is actually my image? I created that image when I was working on the Yokowo Soft X-ray telescope data in Japan in the early 90s. You're welcome, by the way. Their video was entitled, "Can you debunk the grand solar minimum?" Well, the answer to that is yes, and I've produced 3 videos recently that do exactly that. The first one was another one in my Climate Myth series where I point out that a grand solar minimum will not save us from the effects of global warming. The second one was called "Forget a Grand Solar Minimum" because I was pointing out that there are new cycle 25 regions appearing on the Sun. That would imply that cycle 25 is about to start and could be much larger than cycle 24. The third video, the one they took umbrage at, was entitled "Bad News for Grand Solar Minimum Cult," where I point out that solar cycle 24 is still fairly active, producing sunspots and flares, and that means that we're not yet at solar minimum. We may have a year or two to go before that happens. So all the bad weather and other events that they're talking about associated with a grand solar minimum or even a solar minimum can't be, because we're still in the decline phase of solar cycle 24. Grand Solar Minimum News responded with its own video, which took 1 hour and 1 minute to rebut a 4-minute video of mine. I'm serious, it really did. There's the link if you want to listen to an hour's worth of nonsense. Now, the thing I want to point out here is that my original video was not aimed at Grand Solar Minimum News. It was aimed at all those groups that are implying that there's going to be a Grand Solar Minimum in the next few years, 10 years, or 20 years. The fact that they took personal umbrage at this reminds me somewhat of the Carly Simon song. "You're so vain, you probably think this song is about you, don't you?" Well, the one that they got upset about wasn't about them, but this one is. He continuously questions my credentials throughout the video. At one point, for example, he says, "I don't know how official this guy is." Well, a few clicks on the computer would have shown you how official I am. I have a PhD in high energy astrophysics at University College London. I made a video about my degree at University College London and my subsequent career. You're welcome to take a look at that. You can buy my book, The Many Faces of the Sun. I have over 200 publications in refereed journals. You can check those out on LinkedIn and ResearchGate. You could Google BAM's Keith Strong and see 3 of the papers I've written on space weather. I chaired the NASA 2000 Sun-Earth Connection Roadmaps Committee. That's the committee that put space weather into the NASA program. And as far as not knowing anything about solar cycles, I wonder why then I was made a consultant to the NOAA Solar Cycle 24 Prediction Panel, only one of 8 solar physicists from around the world that were so invited. Now I've shown you my credentials, please show me yours. I wonder how you were qualified to talk about this sort of stuff. Or are you just a guy, like you said in a later part of that interminably long video? There is a fundamental misconception running throughout Grand Solar Minimum's video, and that is that he seems to think that solar minimum is an extended period of time. It isn't. It's just a single date. That is because solar minimum is defined in astronomical circles as the lowest point in a 13-month running mean of the international sunspot number. That also means you cannot tell when solar minimum was until at least 6 months later. In fact, you probably have to wait for several years afterwards in order to make sure there isn't a second minimum that follows. So we can be at solar minimum, we can be near solar minimum, but you cannot be in solar minimum. He needs to understand this difference before he rants on at other people about the solar minimum, because he just hasn't got the concept right yet. As an example of this misconception that he has, the very next statement is that a declining total solar radiance is another indication that our sun is moving into solar minimum. That should be towards solar minimum. But that's what happens to TSI during the decay of every single solar cycle. See here below. He provides no proof based on past declines in TSI that any of the weird weather effects are caused by low solar activity. Total solar radiance can explain the whole story. Remember, he keeps on saying that it's obvious that we're at solar minimum. Well, let's see how obvious it really is. I've drawn a black line across the total solar irradiance here, which just brushes the minimum values that were met during the last solar minimum. On the right you can see where we currently are. I put a green line, the equivalent green line there. And you can see we're still well above those levels. Here's the maximum. So let's measure how much from the maximum we're down compared with last time. So there's the full range. And this is how far we've gone down. And if you take a ratio of those two, you can see we're only 90% of the way down to solar minimum. If we trace that green line back to where there was the equivalent time in the previous cycle for this particular level of total solar radiance and compare that to where minimum was, you see we're at least 2 years short of that date. So that would say that solar minimum is probably 1 to 2 years away. Okay, which is it? Is there a grand solar minimum going to occur in 2021? Although he now says that's not possible. 2031, which he claims is most likely, or 2045, which he says is possible. Not very definitive really, is it? And he gives absolutely no scientific evidence for this. He complains about that I don't give scientific evidence, which I do, but he gives none whatsoever of these particular dates. Just what he thinks might happen. Now he uses what I call the ZHARKOVA diversion. He says, he, meaning me, has also done a piece on Miss ZHARKOVA. Pretty disrespectful, or so I am told. I've not watched it. Now that's interesting, isn't it? That he is criticizing me on something that he hasn't watched based on something somebody told him. Well, that sort of slapdash attitude is exactly the problem I have with what he's done on all this solar work. He doesn't check his facts. The disrespect here actually is that he doesn't call her Professor ZHARKOVA, he calls her Miss ZHARKOVA. In fact, at the beginning of my video, I say her mathematical analysis of the solar cycle is perfectly good science. Does that sound disrespectful to you? It doesn't to me. Now, I disagree with her on a number of issues in that video and point out where I think she's wrong. That's not disrespectful. That's what scientists do. They put out their ideas, expect to be confronted about them, and argue, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months, sometimes for years, until that issue is resolved. Apparently, when grand solar minimum says something's exactly the same, he really means it's completely different. He said this about one of the graphs I showed.
And this is the same exact information that Dr. Strong uses as well. Okay, this is where he pulls his sunspot numbers. But here's the number progression.
This is the graph that he said I showed. And if you look closely, you can see that it's from the NOAA Space Weather Prediction Center in Boulder, Colorado. But this was the graph I actually showed. And if you look closely, you can see that it comes from the SIDC, the Solar Influences Data Center in Belgium, which is the world's official repository for sunspot data. And they are completely different. Even the scales are different. NOAA uses a different calculation for sunspot number than the SIDC does. So these are completely different plots. Even though they have a similar shape, they are completely different plots. Now he goes a long time on about this model at the end of the NOAA plot. What he doesn't mention is that model was put together in 2013 when the solar community thought that the sun was going to be producing a much higher cycle than it actually did, and that it would be later. So this model had to say nothing except for the people back in 2013 were wrong. The Solar Influences Data Center runs two models. They're updated every month, so this is January 2019 version, which shows one, a rapid onset of solar cycle 25, which made those new sunspot regions appearing in reverse polarity very interesting and would indicate that that was more likely to be what's happening. However, the other model, you can just about see it there bottoming out, is a long slow decline of solar cycle 24 with a sunspot minimum in a year or two's time. Now that's the one I've been favoring to date, and the fact that this new region, active region 2733, produced a large number of sunspots and also several C flares indicates, I think, that that's the more likely scenario now. He keeps on talking about the sunspot number crashing. I'm not quite sure he knows what he means there. The shortest time between solar maximum and the subsequent solar minimum is 4 years. The longest time from solar maximum to the following minimum is 10 years. I've marked that range on here with this blue arrow. And as you can see, solar cycle 24 has already moved into that range and is more than a year past that minimum time. And if it goes on for another year or two, it's going to put it dead in the middle of that total range. So it'd be a perfectly normal sunspot cycle. So there's no crashing going on. I actually think we're violently agreeing. He said at one point, the peak of this minimum is going to be in 2020 to 2021. Now the peak of the minimum is actually what is called solar minimum. And I say solar minimum will be likely occurring late in this year or next year. So we're not horribly far apart in time. In fact, he thinks we're further away from solar minimum than I do. So why the big fuss? Both of us now agree that we're not at solar minimum yet, so we are still in the decay phase of solar cycle 24. Next, he complains about my ability to count sunspots. He says,
and Mr. Strong is claiming that there's way too many sunspots. This group right here.
please show me where I say that this group shown here is the one that I'm talking about emerging from active region 2733. I don't. It's a background image. And if you'd notice, most of my slides have some sort of background image shaded to a darker shade like this one is. There is no real confusion. He knows that this is not the region, and he knows that because I show the actual active region, 2733, just a few seconds later. I would like to be debating somebody that can actually count. He says,
again, he wants to refer to this grouping as quite a large amount. Is this the biggest sunspot region we've had in a while? Absolutely. 26 was the number on it. But we've had way bigger than that on streaks where we hadn't seen a sunspot in 30 days or 15 to 20 days. And then we get big sunspots. They are typical in minimums to have an occasional big sunspot, but nothing over 26 or 30. Nothing.
I refer to the number of sunspots in the region. He tries to turn that into the size of the sunspots. I'm not saying that sunspots are large, I'm just saying there's a large number of them. That's different. So let's count some sunspots. Remember, the sunspot number is 10 times the number of groups plus the number of sunspots. So on that basis, we'll determine what the sunspot number is in active region 2733. Okay, this is active region 2733, and I'm going to ask you to count the spots. Now this is important. It's on the 26th of January. Remember that date because that will be important later. In the meantime, he says
he sees 45. So, okay, I guess we'll take your word for it, fella.
Now it's quite hard to count spots. So I'm going to make it easier for you because I'm going to put an arrow on every single spot that I can see. Here they are. Now I probably missed some, so this is probably an underestimate. So all you have to do now is count the arrows and then apply the formula. I'll give you a few seconds to do that. So we have one sunspot group here, so we get 10 towards the sunspot number. I count 57 arrows there, so the total sunspot number is 10 plus 57, which is 67. Any reasonable person would say that they can see at least 57 sunspots there. And so the total sunspot number should be 67, which is why I said that the number of 22 that they had is rising. Now, I suspect that the C constant for the Solar Dynamics Observatory is quite low, and obviously it's something like about 0.3. But that's not the sunspot number, that's the international sunspot number. As my mother used to say, proof of the pudding is in the eating. He makes fun of my C flare prediction where I saw the C5 flare on the 26th. I predicted that there'd be more C flares to follow. He thinks that's silly. How is that possible? Give me the proof, buddy, I think he says as well. Well, here's the proof. In the next 2 days, there are 4 more C flares, including another C5. As Albert Einstein used to say, the only source of knowledge is experience. So how did I do this prediction? Experience and knowledge. I've been studying solar cycles for 50 years, ever since I was an amateur in the 1960s. The first thing I did was look at the magnetogram to see where the strong magnetic fields were close together, as in these positions. I next checked the coronal images to see which way the coronal magnetic fields were connected. And you'll see several of them there are at an angle to that neutral line, not directly across it. That indicates the magnetic field is stressed and has a lot of energy in it. So if those magnetic field lines are to reconnect, they will produce a big flare. I also watched the development of that leading spot. It was getting bigger and stronger all the time. And that's usually a sign of a big flare building up. And then I used the flare forecaster's favorite rule of thumb. Once you've had one flare, you're likely to get a second. Actually, my forecast was better than it would seem on YouTube. If you went to my Twitter account, on the 25th of January, that's before the first of the flares, I wrote the following. I would not be surprised to see a C flare out of this region in the next day or two. Note the rising X-ray flux. By the way, that's another thing I use to see whether there's going to be a flare, whether the X-ray flux is rising and at what rate. The more it's rising, the faster it's rising, then the more likely it will produce a flare. Within 12 hours of that forecast, we had the C5 flare. That's quite remarkable. But did Grand Solar Minimum forecast that? Did Suspicious Observer or any of these others? NOAA or NASA? No, none of them did. And they say the scientific understanding of an issue is indicated by your ability to forecast it. He then makes two classic common amateur mistakes. He says,
we know these are dangerous. These could be dangerous. And yet here is another misleading fact of information, guys. He's put the scale of Earth in a position to make it look like that this solar flare is heading towards Earth, okay? But in fact, this solar flare has already turned Earth facing and starting to head towards the western limb, which means it's going to brush, if there is any effect at all, it's going to brush the western part of our magnetic field. So it's not a direct hit. It's not an Earth facing situation.
Flares brush the Earth. No, they don't. A flare is an isotropic event, i.e. it sends out light in all directions, and so will hit all the Earth that's facing towards the Sun at the same time, about 8 minutes after the flare occurred. He's getting confused with a coronal mass ejection, which is the expulsion of a large volume of mass from the Sun. And that might take several days to get here, and it doesn't come straight here, it comes along a curved path. That's the other mistake that he makes. He keeps on talking about Earth facing. Now, this is something that also Suspicious Observer talks a lot about, so I suspect that's where he's got this from. They seem to think that something at the center of the Sun is going to hit the Earth preferentially to something from somewhere else, particularly from the west limb. Now, what he needs to look up is something called the Parker spiral. As the Sun's magnetic field moves out radially from the Sun, that should be the way things are, but only if the Earth were orbiting the Sun at the same rate that the Sun rotates. The Sun rotates once every month, approximately, whereas the Earth takes over a year to get round the Sun. So from the Earth's point of view, the magnetic field lines it's seeing are coming from the west limb of the Sun, not from Sun center. So a coronal mass ejection flowing along those field lines will have to come from the west limb to hit the Earth, not from Sun center. He eventually has a whinge about being called a cult and prefers to be referred to as an information highway. He says,
why we're being called a cult, but I don't look at it as cult. I look at this as the information highway.
Now, if he'd been paying attention in English class when he was a kid, he would know that many English words have multiple meanings, and you need to understand what meaning is being used in a particular context. I was using cult in the sense that something that has become very popular or fashionable among a particular, generally small group of people. If Grand Solar Minimum News is an information highway, I've been pointing out a lot of potholes so far. He keeps telling us that there's cooling during a solar minimum and a grand solar minimum will be much worse. But he doesn't establish any data to say that that is in fact the case. He says,
galactic cosmic rays are a record number, solar activity is plummeting, so if we have our history to look at and base what happened when sunspots were this low, we have only one thing to assume, and that is there's going to be some cooling associated with the grand solar minimum.
So let's take a look at times of low solar activity and see how much cooling there really is. Here's my original sunspot graph, and I'm going to mark on here the 10 warmest years on record. The warmest on record is 2016. That's well down in the decay phase of solar cycle 24, and the sunspot number was about 40, so that's a very, very low number. The second warmest was in 2015, still down in the decay phase of solar cycle 24. And the third warmest was in 2017, near the bottom of the decay of solar cycle 24. The fourth warmest is at the peak of solar cycle 24 in 2014. The fifth warmest is at 2010, just at the very beginning of solar cycle 24, when the sunspot number was less than 30. The sixth warmest was again near solar maximum in 2013. The seventh warmest was back in 2005, well down in the decay phase of solar cycle 23. The eighth warmest was 2009, which is when the sunspot number was less than 20. And 2018 is likely to come into third or fourth place, but that's during the very last parts of the decay of solar cycle 24, when the sunspot number was about 15. So there seems to be a lot of warming going on despite these cool temperatures that are forecast as a result of low solar activity. Next we get into the cosmic ray discussion. He says,
we can go right back to spaceweather.com, guys, okay? They have a team that's monitoring cosmic rays. Cosmic rays, and here we go. Here's the numbers.
But these aren't the numbers. When you look at this page, you can see that this part that he showed you is actually the output of a model. Actually, they are not measuring cosmic rays. They are measuring total radiation dose as from cosmic rays, gamma rays, and X-rays. So it's a mixture of all three. So characterizing this as cosmic rays is inaccurate. He does show you this, which shows that at stratospheric level the radiation dose is increasing. But what he should have shown you was this, the total picture, where you can see the effect of that radiation increase is a function of altitude. Yes, in the stratosphere the radiation dose is increasing. That is precisely what you'd expect as you approach solar minimum. However, 40,000 feet, there doesn't seem to be any particular trend in the data. And same at 25,000 feet. Now the issue here is whether clouds form. For clouds form between 6,000 and 25,000 feet. And so there's no increase in cosmic radiation, so the cosmic rays are not affecting the cloud formation. Some clouds reach up to 40 or 50,000 feet, but those are the top of thunderclouds, and those are not forming there. They are being pushed up by air currents to that altitude. So why is all of this important? Well, the argument goes that more cosmic rays create more clouds reflect away more sunlight, which will have a net cooling effect on the Earth. However, that rather naive argument has a major flaw in it, because these clouds not only reflect away some sunlight, but they also help keep some of the heat in to the surface of the Earth. They act like a blanket. And it's the net effect of these two. Now that effect is what happens during the day. So we've got competing effects, the cooling of the clouds and the warming by the clouds. But at night, the clouds aren't reflecting any radiation away, but they're still keeping the heat in. So for 24 hours a day, the clouds are acting as a blanket, whereas only during the day they also have a cooling effect. And the problem here is you've got to figure out what the net effect is. And according to most meteorologists, the effect is so small they can't tell whether it's a positive or negative effect total. So clouds are not very effective here at creating cooling or warming, and we're seeing at the altitude that the clouds form, the cosmic rays are not reaching that altitude, so they can have no effect. He keeps claiming that cosmic rays are at record levels, but provides actually no proof of same. So I went to the site where they store all the data for the neutron monitors around the globe, which is here at the top of the page, so you can do this yourself and make your own plots. But I chose one for no particular reason called New K, and then plotted the data for the last 50 years. And as you can see, the highest cosmic ray flux was at the last solar minimum. Currently we have an 8% increase in cosmic rays. At the last solar minimum it was more like 11% increase in cosmic rays. So we have a way to go yet. So we can conclude that we're not at record level at the moment. There's still quite a long way to go before we could get to record levels. And so that means we still must be in the decline of solar cycle 24 and not yet at solar minimum, which is what I've been saying all along. Apparently, GSM speaks with a forked tongue. He says,
he thinks everybody thinks the same. He thinks everybody's pushing fear porn and wants to scare people into thinking they got to prep. We do got to prep. We got to start getting our asses in gear when it comes to prepping and learning to grow and being sufficient on our own.
That has got to be the fastest self-contradiction in history. Apparently history is not GSM's strong point. He claims at one point we saw lots of hot weather in the 50s and the 60s. That's important to him because that was where the peak of solar activity was. However, it's not true. If you look at the Met Office's record of global temperatures over this period of time, you can see that in the 50s and 60s, marked by this grey area, we actually had below average global temperatures. So this claim he made is making no sense whatsoever. Next he goes on a rant about flooding, and I don't see what that's got to do with a solar minimum or a grand solar minimum or anything that I said. He says,
You're acting like as if, okay, everything's fine, these people are crazy, there's no GSM, there's no solar minimum effects. That's bull. Look at all the flooding. Tell that to all the people this year who've been flooded out of their homes, not just here in the United States, but all over the world.
GSM needs to show evidence that the two are linked. Was there an unusual amount of flooding in the 2008 to 2010 period during the low sunspot numbers back then, and much lower sunspot numbers than we have now? Then he needs to be able to show a physical connection between the two effects. How a grand solar minimum or a solar minimum will lead to more rain. He hasn't done that, and he probably can't do that because nobody else has been able to do that. Well, let me school GSM in how this should be done. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. You can't just make that a statement, you have to prove it. So you'd show some experiments where carbon dioxide absorbs infrared radiation and scatters it. There's lots of experiments out there to do that. Therefore, more carbon dioxide means more warming. That's a simple radiative transfer calculation. It also means that the air can hold more moisture. You would show the relationship between the ambient temperature and the amount of humidity that the air has. More evaporation from warmer waters when the waters are warm. So you would show the evaporation rate equations depending on temperature. So there's more energy in the system, which creates more instability. So you look at the instability equations and plug in some of the numbers and show that in fact is the case. If you have more instability, you have more rain and more violent storms. So you would show the connection between energy in the system and the amount of rainfall and the amount of energy dissipated by those storms. But both of those things lead to more flooding. All these statements just by themselves mean nothing. You need to back that up with the equations that apply to the situation and plug in the numbers to those equations to show that you're of the right order of magnitude of effect. Now, none of the things that he is claiming about cosmic rays or grand solar minima or solar minima are backed up by any of that sort of thing. They're just qualitative statements. Science is about quantitative as well as qualitative. Let's see if we can summarize this. First of all, this video he did, actually most of what his channel has, is based on a misconception that solar minimum is an extended period of time. It isn't, it's a date. It is defined by the astronomical community as being a particular date, as in December of 2008. If he doesn't like the term, if he doesn't like the way that the astronomy community have defined solar minimum, then don't use the term. He actually admits that we're maybe a year or two away from solar minimum, just like I did. So why the big fuss? But if we're not yet at solar minimum, then we are still in the decay of solar cycle 24, which is what I've been saying all along. He makes many deceptive and inaccurate statements. First of all, he questions my credentials right out of the bat, without checking them. That's sloppy thinking. He even has an assistant that could have checked them for him before making a fool of himself. I use my real name so people can check me out. He said my ZHARKOVA video was disrespectful, then admitted he hadn't watched it yet. What sort of argument is that? He laughs at my sea flare prediction. Yet, was it right? It was dead on. So I would expect in his next video to have an abject apology from him about that. There were many, many more such silly errors all the way through this video. In fact, my video would have been twice as long if I had tried to answer his points point by point, which was my original intention. But worst of all, I responded to his original video by going to his comment section and answering his points point by point. So what did he do with that? Did he engage in a scientific debate with me, or let his followers debate me on this? No. He deleted them so nobody could see those comments. That is not how science is done. If he comes over here and makes a comment about this video, I will leave it there providing it follows my YouTube rules. But he doesn't. He just deletes my comments. He doesn't want debate. He just wants to put out his propaganda to sell more coffee mugs. If you think buying a Grand Solar Minimum t-shirt or coffee mug is going to in some way inoculate you against the effects of a Grand Solar Minimum, no matter how unlikely it is to occur, you are very much mistaken. All you're doing is lining this clown's pocket. If you want to find out what's going on in the sun, go to one of the channels like spaceweather.com or Solar Ham and read what actually is going on. That's all he's doing. He's taking their pronouncements, repackaging them and claiming them the information for himself. What I would ask my viewers to do is to go over to his video and post a link to this. This inevitably will be deleted, but nonetheless, if enough people start to see this, then some of them may be inclined to understand that this guy doesn't know what he's talking about as far as the sun, the solar cycle, or the effects of solar variability on the planet Earth. So until next time, goodbye.